Funding for Idaho Reports is provided by the Friends of 4, 10, and 12, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by a grant from the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation.
A record number of steelhead are making their way up the Columbia River, but Idaho officials worry that most of them won't have a chance to reach Idaho water. Good evening. Pacific Northwest fisheries officials are reporting this week that a record number of steelhead fish have passed the Bonneville Dam on the lower Columbia River. Well in excess of 300,000 fish have passed the dam. That's a survival rate that biologists frankly hadn't expected to reach until the year 2000. That's the good news. The bad news is that the Idaho Fish and Game Department and its officials are increasingly concerned that fewer fish will reach Idaho streams than perhaps even did last year. So concerned is the Fish and Game Commission that a week ago it asked Oregon officials to limit the commercial fishing on the Columbia River, which would have the effect of limiting Indian gillnet fishing in that area. The restoration of ocean-going fish runs in Idaho is certainly not a new issue. It's been around for years. But over the last several years, major new steps have been taken to help the fish return. Tonight, we'll get an assessment of just how well those efforts have been working. Anadromous fish are fish that run upstream from the ocean to spawn in freshwater streams. In Idaho, they include salmon and steelhead. Steelhead actually are ocean-going rainbow trout. These fish spend about half their lives in freshwater and half in saltwater. After hatching in streambed gravels, the young develop for a year or two in freshwater streams or lakes. Then as smolts, they migrate to the ocean, usually on the spring flood. After 1 to 3 years in the ocean, the adults ascend the rivers to continue the cycle. Once salmon and steelhead in almost inconceivable numbers made their way upstream to spawn in Idaho, as many as 1,000 miles from the ocean. At certain times of the year, they filled the tributaries of the Snake River upstream to Shoshone Falls in southern Idaho and to the headwaters of the Salmon and Clearwater in the central part of the state. For millennia, Native Americans harvested salmon and steelhead each year at places where the migrations were slowed and concentrated, places like Celilo Falls on the Columbia River. To the non-Indians who settled the Northwest in the 19th century, the runs of ocean-going fish must have seemed inexhaustible. But annual harvests of 30 and 40 million pounds quickly depleted the runs. Meanwhile, mining, logging, and farming each took their toll on upstream spawning areas. In the 1930s, the great public works projects that helped pull the Northwest out of the Depression threw a new series of obstacles in the way of the fish. The obstacles, dams. Dams for cheap hydropower, dams for irrigation projects, a chain of dams up the Columbia and Snake Rivers that eventually enabled ocean-going ships to reach Idaho, but made it increasingly difficult for ocean-going fish to get up and down the rivers. By the late 1970s, the combined effects of commercial fishing, development, and the dams had ended salmon and steelhead runs on the Upper Snake and Columbia Rivers and brought other runs to the edge of extinction. Commercial and sport fisheries had declined sharply. In 1980, Congress addressed the problem. The Northwest Power Act made saving the fish a requirement of the continued operation and development of the region's vast hydropower system. Under the act, the Northwest Power Planning Council is charged with factoring the salmon and steelhead into the region's energy plan. Larry Mills is one of Idaho's 2 members on that Regional Power Planning Council. Mr. Mills has worked extensively in the past several years in the council's fish and wildlife plans. Are we seeing any real progress as a result of the council's action yet on helping these fish get back up the river?
I think we will see it, but as of now, it's just beginning. One day soon, I think that you will see some breakthroughs, and some, especially in the next year, that will show that we have made some progress.
One of the major elements of the council's plan has been a water budget. Tell me how that works, and is it working?
Yes, we have had 2 years so far. The first year was kind of a practice year. Last year was somewhat for real, and the next spring will be the first real test of that. What it does is create an artificial spring freshet flood that will move those smolt to the ocean rapidly. certainly within 60 days, and their original time without the dams in the river was about 30 days. But this will get them down there, and there will be a far larger survival rate than there have been in the past without a water budget.
Again, the smolt are the young fish that are making their first trip down the river.
The young anadromous fish, salmon steelhead.
You've needed, obviously, the cooperation of a lot of people, not the least of which is the Idaho Power Company in this state. Is that working?
Very well. We have, of course, each person or company has its own problems that they must solve, but I must say with Idaho Power Company, and especially with Mr. Bruce, we have had great cooperation.
Can the same be said for the cooperation with all of the other entities in the region that have to cooperate by necessity to make this effort work?
Well, they have done pretty well too. Not, I think, probably to the same extent that Idaho Power has, because Idaho Power people are close to us here in Boise. We have had good luck with them. But we've gotten along with all the agencies. As they showed up with problems, we were able to solve them.
There just are so many separate players in this, the power companies, the Bonneville Power Administration, the Army Corps of Engineers, the Indian tribes up and down the river. There are so many players, just by necessity makes it difficult, right?
Oh, it certainly does. We have new ball players in the park every day. Every new problem creates somebody else that we have to deal with. But we get along with them.
And the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has come under some criticism by the chairman of the council recently.
Yes.
for not understanding what you're trying to do, basically.
Well, they paid no attention until I think we arrived on the scene. But I think one day soon we'll work that one out too.
Finally, Mr. Mills, you said that it would be a little while yet before we saw some improvement, something tangible that we could attach to the council's efforts. How long, and what magnitude?
Well, 1 year at least, and then it will be. All those fish didn't disappear at once, nor will they come back at once. But I would think that someday within 5 years that you will see a strong return of those young fish.
We'll come back, sir. Thank you.
Yeah.
Another effort is being mounted in Idaho to help restore the ocean-going fish runs. It's the hatchery rearing of young trout. Here on the South Fork of the Salmon River near Warm Lake, eggs are taken from returning female fish, sperm from the males, and then used for artificial spawning in Idaho hatcheries. Such programs have led to a marked improvement in the number of adult Chinook salmon who return to Idaho. This past year, the South Fork of the Salmon has seen twice as many adults return as had been projected. Another program to help the fish return involves transporting them around the many dams on the Columbia River. Getting the fish up and down the rivers requires close cooperation among a tangle of federal, state, and Indian tribal agencies. And getting them to cooperate has not always been an easy job.
Inland, I represent the inland sport fishermen. And so I have it. However, most of the people that I work with there, I'm at odds with. I'm always trying to reduce the harvest on the ocean so that we, of course, get more fish back into the river. So it's not a real friendly experience.
Clearly, as Norm Guth suggests, frustration is being felt by the Idaho Department of Fish and Game and the Fish and Game Commission. Jerry Conley is the director of Fish and Game for the state of Idaho. Mr. Conley, part of your frustration is in not, I guess, in your view, being adequately represented among the groups that make these important decisions about how the fish are managed on the rivers, correct?
Well, that's correct, Mark. Actually, we're at the end of a funnel, and the fish have got to come all the way up to that funnel to reach Idaho. And unfortunately, what happens at the lower end of that funnel and out in the ocean really affects what happens to our seasons here. And that's been a real problem. It may be one of the biggest problems facing us today in managing these anadromous fish.
I mentioned at the beginning of the program that you have asked, the Commission has asked Oregon to, in effect, limit the ocean take or the commercial take of fish. What kind of response did you get to that?
Not satisfactory from our standpoint. The initial response was basically to ignore our request, and that was followed by finally a realization that not only did we have a problem in our streams in Idaho, but Oregon and Washington also had a problem in their upriver areas, on the Imnaha, the Grand Ronde rivers, those type systems. And so now the most recent response has been pretty receptive, and they have basically agreed to try to shut down the seasons on the Columbia River.
What would that mean to the Indians who do the commercial fishing there?
Well, from my standpoint, it would mean, and from theirs too, certainly, it would mean a cessation of their fishing effort, and I think not too soon in anybody's mind. We've been very concerned about the gill netting that's gone on by
So you're not talking,
Indians.
excuse me, you're not talking just about limiting it, you're talking about shutting it down.
Well, at this stage, because you have to realize that there's been 25 days already of gill netting in the 3 pools up above Bonneville, and in that time period, the Indian tribes, Intertribal Fish Commission, the 4 tribes, have basically taken a minimum of 67,000 steelhead. So I think it's not too soon to be shut down.
We should maybe just explain, gill netting is a net that is physically placed in the water that's virtually impossible for the fish to get through.
Well, that's correct. And to put it in proper perspective, in the 3 pools above Bonneville, there's something like 740 gill nets at the height of the fishing that were in there. So a fish coming from Bonneville had to go through somehow 740 gill nets to finally get above this maze that was designed to trap the fish.
And I guess to sort of turn the equation around, if those fish are not getting upstream from to Idaho, you are doing things like the hatchery rearing project that we saw a moment ago that are putting a lot of fish down the river, but in effect, is Idaho sort of supplying the fisheries for those other 2 states?
To put it in proper perspective, this year it looks like that 75% of the steelhead coming over Bonneville Dam are destined originally for Idaho. So therefore, 75% of those fish were produced in Idaho originally. Now, you got to keep in mind you're talking about 2 different things here. You're talking about hatchery fish,
right,
and you're talking about wild steelhead. And our plans are to try to have a balance of about 50% of each. But you cannot harvest the wild fish at the same rate you harvest the hatchery fish. So our primary concern this year is with the wild fish that are coming back. While we're seeing an excess in some areas of hatchery fish coming back, we are short of wild fish coming back to be able to fill this habitat we have in the state.
Finally, Mr. Conley, you heard Mr. Mills talk about some of the frustrations in dealing with the maze of bureaucracy and different agencies and competing interests. Why is there so much difficulty, though, in sorting this problem out? Idaho's been hassling with Washington and Oregon for years over this.
Well, I think the problem perhaps gets back to individual greed on different parties' parts. No one wants to give up what they perceive to be their fair share. They have no assurance that they're going to get a crack at those fish later on. And so everybody tries to take the maximum number possible before the fish gets past their particular point of harvest. And I think that's led to a situation in which people haven't looked out for the overall good of the resource.
Short-term gain.
Short-term gain.
We'll come back. Final view of this tonight comes from Ed Cheney. He's worked extensively on the Regional Power Act during its formation, and he's worked for 20 years with the salmon and steelhead issue in the Pacific Northwest. Mr. Cheney runs an environmental consulting firm in Idaho. You've been involved in this for a long time. Are we making any progress in getting the fish runs back?
Well, I think the fact that we've got a record steelhead run is pretty good evidence that we can make progress, and it's excellent evidence that the program that Larry is involved with, the Northwest Power Planning Council, of its promise and where we can be in 5 years or so. At the same time, the problems we're faced with basically with an overharvest of a wild population, predominantly steelhead headed for Idaho, is also clear evidence that some of the underlying problems haven't been resolved, and these problems, in my view, tend to or have the potential for jeopardizing everything that we've been working for a number of years. And this is not an Indian problem. This is a problem with all fisheries, given the fact that we have such an imbalance in hatchery fish and naturally produced fish. It's much quicker for us to get the hatchery population up and mixed in with them, coming tagging along and increasing at a slower rate, or the natural fish. But everybody wants to go fishing today, and that creates some very serious problems.
What are the underlying problems then, as you see them?
They're twofold, actually. One is, as Jerry alluded to, we don't have now, nor have we ever had, an allocation scheme that equitably allocates whatever harvestable surplus is available among all the competing parties. And there are about 20 of those, 20 separate governmental entities that compete with Idaho fishermen for spring Chinook salmon, for example, which are caught from Alaska to California. So we don't have a regional allocation plan. It's not quite everything being up for grabs, but it's very close to it. Second, we have just the physical fact that our enhancement efforts tend to enhance the hatchery fish first, and people who have been deprived of fish for a very long time are reluctant to not catch all the hatchery fish that are available. But if they do, they catch too many of the wild fish. To the extent that that continues, it could jeopardize the funding for the total enhancement effort, which was predicated in large part upon restoring the natural runs, including the Northwest Power Act.
Right. So would I be stating it correctly if I were to say that we've made really substantial progress on some of these habitat questions, like finding ways to get the fish back down the river, get them up the river? We've done pretty well with that, but we're still basically hassling over the political problem of how to divide up this wonderful natural resource.
I think that's absolutely correct. That, dividing up what's catchable, and second, developing a regional philosophy of how important are the natural runs to what we're trying to do in the entire Columbia River Basin. That's a question that, the most critical one, and it really hasn't been addressed.
Well, on that point, let's open it up and invite these other two gentlemen to get back in here too. Mr. Mills, would you agree with that assessment?
I certainly would. One of the things that you find every day is that the states of Oregon and Washington don't like each other very well. They are kind of like North and the South in Civil War down there. They can't even agree on too well on seasons in which to catch these fish. One day, these people have got to be brought to heel to where they find out that, and they're beginning to realize that now, that Idaho is not going to be a pond for those people anymore. We're doing the best we can up in this state, and I think with more skill than they are downstream, and I think that we'll have to work it out. I think the organization to which I belong, the Power Council, is very anxious to do that, and I think they will do it.
Well, do we really have much clout when it comes to doing that sort of thing?
Well, we have clout, especially by withholding some money, which seems to be
That
pretty
sometimes works, doesn't it?
it sure does.
How would that work in this case, though? What kind of money?
Well, the Power Council has at its, in the wisdom of the Congress, they said the Power Council will make the plans. We don't furnish the money or the expertise to do many of these things, and most of that is done by Bonneville and the other agencies. But if the recommendation has to come from the Power Council. And my colleagues and in the council, as individuals, we get along pretty well with those people. I'm like Mr. Conley, I'm not that entranced with some of the fish and game people that appear before us. Montana, of course, is on our side on this thing.
Mr. Cheney, Mr. Mills seems to be saying that it is possible to do what you suggest needs to be done. Are you as optimistic?
Well, I think definitely it's possible. I think we've got 40 years of experience to tell us all the things that don't work. And it appears to me, at least, that the only thing that will work is basically to use the funding carrot as a whip and basically withhold funding until the region, and this is just not the Fish and Game agencies, they're just political entities within a much broader political context, until the states devise a rational way to allocate the allowable harvest and can demonstrate that cooperatively they can spend these ratepayer and taxpayer funds wisely. After 20 years, it's my view, unless they're forced to do that before further funding is forthcoming, it'll never happen.
So all of the good that the Power Council is trying to do will not do any good if we don't solve this problem.
I think that's absolutely right. Not that it won't do any good. It's that we are faced with the prospect of losing the naturally produced runs, which were the basis of the funds to be forthcoming in the first place. Once we do that, I think it's going to be very difficult to convince the ratepayers and the taxpayers that they should continue funding these enhancement programs.
Mr. Conley, agree with that?
Well, I do. From our standpoint, of course, we deal with the day-by-day problems. We talk to the fishermen, we talk to the Indian tribes. Again, I say we're at the end of the funnel, and it's very frustrating for us. We see all the elements falling into place except this element of allocation. And if we can somehow get to that aspect where people feel comfortable with passing on past their point of harvest certain numbers, where that the people on upstream feel comfortable knowing that that number is coming up that can be harvested, I think we'll be over the bulk of the problem. But this year points out the real frustrations. We've, in the state of Idaho, have been absolutely laying off harvesting wild fish this year. And through our leadership, we convinced the states of Oregon and Washington last year to enter into a program to do the very same thing. All the fish that are produced in hatcheries now are marked, the smolts that are going back down the ocean are marked, so that when they come back up, the sportsman can tell whether it's a hatchery fish or a wild fish. We've done that to try to lay off these wild fish. And then suddenly we see we see one harvest group, in this particular case the Indian tribes, harvesting very large numbers of these fish. And it's very difficult for us to go back and ask the Power Council for additional funds for habitat, to ask the sportsmen to be patient or anything on that line when they see this occurring downstream.
The president of the Idaho Wildlife Federation just a week ago, when the commission was sending the word to Oregon, was very critical of the state's congressional delegation for not doing more in a political way. Is that needed, Mr. Conley?
If the harvest that's going on right now continues downstream with no thought to the future on the part of the Indian tribes, then what's going to be needed is congressional look at the treaty rights that are involved and changing the allocation, either declaring steelhead a non-commercial species and reimbursing the Indian tribes for their loss of that particular right, or something along that line. And if we can't come to grips with this allocation problem between Indian and non-Indian, that will have to be the final answer.
Mr. Cheney, agree with that?
I would again emphasize that is one part of the problem. We have exactly the same problem with the state of Alaska, exactly the same problem with Canada, exactly the same problem with the state of Washington, state of Oregon. There has to be a comprehensive allocation scheme put in place through the political process that's got some teeth in it, or just solving what this year is a quote-unquote Indian problem is not going to solve the big problem.
Mr. Mills, the powerful chairman of the House Energy Committee, Congressman Dingell from Michigan, held some hearings recently about some of these issues and was very critical of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and particularly saying that they weren't taking into account the impact of low-head hydro projects, which are being proposed on the drawing boards all over the region, and factoring that into this equation. Are you concerned about that impact?
The small hydro
Yes,
impact?
sir.
Yes, indeed I am. I'm not concerned about one individual project, but the cumulative effect of many of them is a disaster to the movement of fish. And if you don't get fish up the river to spawn and get those small fish back to the ocean, away she goes. But I think that we'll find the cooperation between the states, especially I think that we've got the attention of the state of Washington and Oregon now. One of these fellows from Washington the other day asked me, were you serious in Idaho when you talked about putting some wire netting down so the fish couldn't get either up or down? I just kind of shrugged and said, it's possible. But they they're not going to run this state anymore from down there.
Mr. Cheney, we had a decision here, or what some are calling a decision about the Swan Falls Snake River water rights issue this past Monday. And there's already concern being expressed by conservationists and environmentalists about what reducing the stream flow in the Snake River would do to these fish runs. You concerned about that?
I'm only concerned because I don't see any evidence in the agreement, which I've only scanned, that the potential for conflict with what we're trying to accomplish on the Northwest Power Act has been examined at all in the process of negotiations. That concerns me, and being the president of one of Southwest Idaho's oldest irrigation companies, it also concerns me that I haven't seen a clear demonstration of the benefits and the cost of this proposed agreement. Who's going to get the benefits and who's going to pay the cost? Hopefully, before the legislature takes action, they will request of the appropriate entity what is in effect an economic impact statement, so that we can have that kind of information to make, which I think is just essential to making an intelligent decision.
So possibly there are some reasons to be concerned about it.
There are always reason to be concerned unless you see evidence to the contrary. That's one thing experience has told us. But it would not be appropriate to say that there's any certainty that that agreement as it's laid out does create a problem.
Mr. Conley, how about it?
Ed's expressed it pretty well. We haven't had a chance to look in detail at the agreement. The increased flow assurance in stretches of the river probably bodes well for resident species. The diversion of water, continued diversion of water for irrigation development purposes obviously means less water to carry anadromous fish downstream.
Mr. Mills, could a decision like that in effect negate much of the good that the Power Council's been able to start to put in place?
Certainly could have a great effect on it, for good or evil, depending on which way it goes.
And too early to tell, I guess, at this point.
Yes, it is. We'll just have to see what occurs, but I think Mr. Conley and Mr. Cheney and I and many others like us are going to watch that very closely.
Just a brief moment left. Mr. Cheney, Mr. Mills said earlier 5 years would give us some idea of whether these things have been successful, assuming the best case situation here. Is it possible in that length of time to really see some additional major improvement in these fish runs?
No, I don't think there's any question that the enhancement efforts that are underway, that are in the Fish and Wildlife Program developed by Northwest Power Council, are pretty extensive. We know, as we have evidence this year, these fish are very resilient. Given the opportunity to reproduce themselves, they can spring back very quickly.
Thank you all, gentlemen, Mr. Cheney, Mr. Conley, and Mr. Mills, for joining us tonight. We'll be back tomorrow night. I'm Mark Johnson. Good night.